Welcome, everyone, to our session this afternoon or this morning, depending where you are in the country. My name is Steve Mantis. I'm a member of the Disability and Work Canada Steering Committee, and I represent the Ontario Network of Injured Workers Groups. Our session today is lightning talks. We have three great presentations coming up for you in the next hour. The first is creating an inclusive culture for employees in practice. The second will be disclosure and accommodations in the workplace guide. And the third will be persistent gaps in hiring and retaining employees with speech disabilities. You can check out the bios for all of the speakers on our website. You click on the picture, you go to the dashboard, pick on speakers. There's a number of ways you can get there, but we have some amazing people presenting today, and I don't want to spend too much time. I want to give them their time rather than talking about them. There will be discussion periods, hopefully at the end of each presentation. Please put your questions or comments in the Q&A box or in the chat, and we'll be able to then see those and pass those along to the presenters following each one of the presentations. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to our first presentation, which is creating an inclusive culture for employees in practice. Take it away. Thanks so much.
Perfect. Thank you, Steve. My name's Mandy, and I work at BDO Canada, and I'm joined by Lisna. Lisna is from Coast Capital Savings, and we wanted to share with you a little bit of the experience we've had in our own organizations in driving accessibility forward for both employees, or for Lisna's case for members, or for me for our customers or our clients. And some of the largest challenges that we've seen organizations face. So let's go to the next slide. So we have three different areas we wanted to talk to you a little bit about today. The first challenge that we often see in organizations is identifying and prioritizing all of the barriers that people face within their organizations. So I'm from BDO Canada, and we support organizations all across Canada in identifying barriers and doing assessments of those organizations to figure out where are their barriers, and then what should they do to begin removing those barriers. At the same time, at BDO Canada, we are also on our own accessibility journey. So we are also internally trying to figure out how do we become a more accessible organization for persons with disabilities. And what we've done is at BDO, we've developed our own assessment. And so we go out, it's pretty fulsome. It's very, very long, and Lisna can attest to that. It's a pretty fulsome assessment. And we've looked at organizations across the country and given them ideas of where there are challenges in their organizations and also where they're doing really well. We also did an assessment of our own organization, and we learned a lot from that assessment about where there are challenges faced by persons with disabilities, especially employees. So BDO, we also work with Lisna at Coast Capital, and we have been working together for a few years. So while we're doing this work internally and in other places, I wanted Lisna to talk about the work that we've been doing together over the last few years at Coast Capital. So over to you, Lisna. And next slide, please.
Thank you, Mandy. I know that in the chat we're still waiting to switch out the display so you guys can see it larger. So I do appreciate the patience, but I'll continue going on for the sake of time and respect for the other speakers today. So starting our journey towards accessibility, it was a really daunting experience. And as Mandy indicated, we had her team do an assessment for us, and they identified 46 barriers and over 100 recommendations. This could have been overwhelming, but instead we clarified our path forward. We knew that to make real progress, we needed a structured approach. We started by bringing voices from across the organization to ensure our path was shaped by multiple perspectives. This inclusive approach set the tone for how we tackled each of the recommendations. So for each recommendation, we numbered it from 1 to 103, I believe. We applied a specific criteria, asking ourselves, can this be implemented in the short term? And short term was defined as in 3 years. Can it be managed within the department accountable for that recommendation? Or do we need to have cross-functional collaboration? Do we need to have additional resources and budget involved? We also aligned with the standards like the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, which was very critical for us, as well as considering whether each recommendation had an impact on the employee engagement and representation for persons with disabilities at Coast. Next slide. To map out our priorities, we used a 4-quadrant graph plotting each recommendation on impact versus effort. Next slide. This approach helped us focus on high impact, easy to implement actions immediately, while longer term, higher effort items were mapped up for our extended longer term plans. And these are the examples here is like some of our digital accessibility pieces that required IT infrastructure and a lot of resourcing. Those are the items that we knew that were important, but it would take us a long time. Ultimately, this method helped us prioritize 54 actions, next slide, for our accessibility plan. By focusing on our resources that were most impactful to our changes, we created a roadmap that was both actionable and achievable. Back to you, Mandy. And we're already on the next slide.
Yeah, so I would just say like it was a lot of work to go through and do a full assessment, did lots of consultations, talked to a lot of people, we did surveys, we looked at lots of documents, and out of that we had all these recommendations, and working together we were able to really figure out how to approach it in a way that was manageable. Next slide, please. So the next challenge that we often face in organizations everywhere, but even at BDO Canada, the work we're doing internally and at Coast, is then how do you create a culture that actually isn't just about removing barriers for compliance, but going beyond that and thinking about how to have everyone feel accepted and included. And so something that we've done at BDO Canada is we started to assess on culture. So not just do we assess on the different priority areas in the Accessible Canada Act or AODA, but we also just look at the culture itself. And we have different indicators that we look at to get a sense of how is the culture doing at that organization. So some of the things that we then might recommend are having events around accessibility, or having organizational structures that have people in place that actually do the work of accessibility, as well as having committees or groups that come together across the organization. So it's something really important that I think organizations sometimes overlook, is it's not just about those compliance pieces, but it's also about creating that foundational culture where people with disabilities can be included and can thrive at work. Next slide. Now over to you, Lisna, to talk a little bit more about what's happening at Coast in this area.
Thank you, Mandy. So at Coast, thanks to Mandy's team of prioritizing culture, embedding accessibility in the governance and culture piece has been a foundational to our journey. From the start, we knew that accessibility couldn't just be a checkbox activity, as Mandy indicated, or a compliance measure. It had to be a part of who we were. So after we published our first accessibility plan, I took on the role of the accessibility lead to drive this commitment forward and to ensure that our strategies translated into everyday actions. Our major driver for this cultural shift has been our Disability Employee Resource Group, or short ERG. They have been instrumental in raising awareness and fostering engagement across the entire organization. Through initiatives during National Accessibility Week, National Disability Employment Awareness Month, they've made accessibility an ongoing priority that resonates with the entire organization. They've created safe spaces for employees to share their personal experiences around disability, which has been so vital for having some deep conversations about experiences. These conversations have built empathy and understanding, integrating accessibility into our daily interactions and decisions. Next slide. From a governance perspective, accessibility is now embedded into our accountability framework, and which is right now shown on the slide. And in my role as accessibility lead, I support this particular structure, ensuring that the focus is in consistency across the various teams and keeping accessibility aligned with our organizational values. Next slide. Ensure that there's regular updates and structured feedback mechanisms were also put in place to ensure accessibility remains the lasting priority and embedded in operations. On the practical side, we've implemented role-specific training on accessibility across our digital interfaces, our physical spaces, as well as procurement. This is ensuring that that structure that was just shown is that every employee, regardless of their role, understands how accessibility impacts their work and can apply it for meaningfully. Next slide. As someone with a lived experience with disability and as a mom with a child with a disability, I wanted to share with you that I wanted to see a very human-centric approach that matters to all of us. As mentioned with Mandy, compliance and checkbox is often what sometimes comes through when we're implementing accessibility, and I didn't want to go through that. So to support the launch of our very first strategy in our organization on accessibility, I shared my own story in our intranet site, helping shift the narrative towards accessibility as a collective movement. And so by aligning both our culture and our governance, making accessibility became a core part of who we are. Back to you, Mandy.
Yeah, so along with culture, while it's so important to lay that foundation where it feels human, and it shows that it impacts all of us and provides that foundational level of understanding. It's also important to be able to measure what you're doing so that you can show progress. And we found that at BDO, it's especially important to demonstrate that progress to our leadership. Next slide, please. Yeah, so some of the things that we've been doing internally to measure our progress is, for the first time this year, we did a firm-wide survey on accessibility in the workplace. So all across the country at BDO, our employees got a survey all about accessibility. And so for the first time, we have baseline data about the number of employees who identify as having disabilities. We have information about their experiences at work, both around physical spaces, digital spaces, what it's like to be an employee, where they would like to see us make improvements. We've got a really great baseline set of data, both qualitative and quantitative information. And we're using that information to help us improve and to demonstrate our progress over time for all of our employees, but especially for our leadership. So I'll hand it off to Lisna. She can tell you more about what they're doing internally too at Coast and how we worked on shaping the measurements.
Thanks, Mandy. Over to the next slide. Our approach to measuring accessibility started with understanding what our baseline was and then making a clear path forward. So what we used was something called the Global Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Benchmark, which has been simplified on this slide, where we assessed where we stood on our accessibility journey, which helped us recognize our maturity level and identify key areas of improvement. At the macro level, this benchmark allowed us to track our growth from a reactive approach to a more proactive and progressive stance on accessibility. Next slide. On a more detailed level, we looked at metrics like our employee engagement score. And this year, for the first time, we were able to break this down by equity deserving groups, including persons with disabilities. We also track a representation of persons with disabilities in our workforce, turnover within this group, as well as applicant to hire data for candidates with disabilities. These metrics help us ensure that our recruitment and retention practices are inclusive and that we're moving forward towards meaningful representation. Next slide. Building on the quantitative insights from our engagement representation data, we also prioritize gathering feedback to understand the lived experience behind the numbers. So for employees, we formally gather annual feedback from those with disabilities with the support of the BDO team, including insights from the Disability ERG and the Mental Health Network. We provide multiple feedback channels all year long, including email, phone, mail, an anonymous online form. So employees and our members that we serve alike can share their experiences and challenges. And what's also important to us is how that culture of accessibility is going out and who we're serving, which is getting feedback from our members. And so we conduct regular surveys to understand their experiences with accessibility as they're interacting with Coast Capital, to allow us to identify and address any barriers that they encounter. So combining the macro metrics with the detailed engagement and representation data and direct feedback from those who were the most impacted, we were able to take a comprehensive approach to measuring accessibility, allows us to gauge our progress, continuously refine our practices based on real-world insights from our employees. And that's about it from me. I think, Mandy, do you have any last words? I think we have some Q&A time now.
Yeah, well, I know we've got about 3 minutes, and I'll just say before our 3 minutes start here, I think Lisna and I have both been doing this for a while, and I feel like we've both encountered a lot of the challenges that other organizations face when it comes to where do you start on being more accessible? How do you change your culture? How do you measure the impacts? And so, if you have any questions outside of this and you want to reach out to us, please reach out. We'd be happy to talk and share any kind of information we can give you on what we've seen work or not work. So I'll stop there.